In early 1943, the Third Reich stood confident, untouchable, unbreakable. The factories of the Ruhr Valley thundered day and night, pouring out the steel and fire that fueled Hitler's war machine. German commanders believed their industrial empire was safe, protected by distance, defenses, and the illusion of superiority. The Americans, they thought, were too inexperienced, too far away, too untested in the skies over Europe. But on one cold night, that illusion was burned away. The hum of distant engines grew into a storm, echoing across the skies of western Germany. Thousands looked up, expecting thunder. What they saw were silver shapes slicing through the clouds, carrying destruction in their bellies. Then came the first flashes. The ground trembled, and the air filled with fire and dust. In a matter of hours, entire factories vanished, reduced to smoking craters. Germany's heart, once so sure of its strength, began to beat with fear, and from that night onward, the war would never again belong to them.
By early 1943, the Third Reich stood at what many believed was its peak. From the Atlantic coast of France to the snows of the Soviet frontier, Nazi banners flew over nearly all of continental Europe. The Wehrmacht had crushed armies, toppled governments, and built an empire that stretched farther than any Germany had ever known. Its power didn't just come from conquest, it came from production. The heart of that power beat deep in western Germany, in a place called the Ruhr Valley. This region wasn't just a cluster of factories, it was the industrial soul of the Reich. The Ruhr produced over half of Germany's steel and coal, and nearly two-thirds of its armaments. Giants like Krupp, Siemens, and Thyssen fueled Hitler's vision of total war, turning raw material into tanks, artillery, and aircraft at a speed unmatched by any other nation. To the Nazi leadership, the Ruhr was untouchable. Layered beneath webs of anti-aircraft guns and guarded by squadrons of Luftwaffe fighters, it was considered the most fortified industrial zone on Earth. The Germans called it their steel shield, the foundation that would keep the war machine running indefinitely. As long as the Ruhr stood, the Reich would stand with it. The confidence ran deep. Hitler and his generals were convinced that Germany's defenses were impenetrable, that the Allied air forces would never dare to strike the heart of their empire in daylight. The Luftwaffe had built a vast network of radar stations, searchlights, and interceptor bases across the Western Front. High above, gunners manned the infamous flak wall, a curtain of anti-aircraft fire so thick that pilots joked you could walk across it. Every inch of sky, they believed, belonged to them. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a different vision of warfare was taking shape. The United States Army Air Forces, new to the European front, were preparing to challenge Germany's supremacy in the skies. Their plan was audacious, almost unthinkable, to fly massive formations of bombers in broad daylight, directly into enemy airspace, and destroy specific industrial targets with surgical precision. The Americans called it precision daylight bombing. The Germans called it suicide. But while the Luftwaffe dismissed the idea, American engineers and strategists were quietly building the tools to make it possible. The B-17 Flying Fortress, bristling with machine guns and capable of absorbing tremendous damage, was unlike any bomber the world had seen. Paired with a revolutionary Norden bomb sight, it promised accuracy that could cripple factories, bridges, and rail hubs without the need to carpet bomb entire cities. Inside Luftwaffe headquarters, generals scoffed. "No bomber will ever reach the Ruhr in daylight," declared Albert Kesselring with absolute certainty, and for a time he seemed right. Early Allied raids were scattered and costly. Hundreds of airmen never returned. To Berlin, it was proof that American idealism would crumble under German firepower. But while Hitler focused his gaze eastward, toward the frozen battlefields of Stalingrad and Kursk, the real threat was growing quietly in the West. The Americans were learning, adapting, and assembling a strategy that would reach far beyond the front lines. For every failed mission, they refined their tactics. For every fallen crew, they built a stronger formation. What began as a costly experiment would soon evolve into a storm unlike anything the Reich had ever faced. By the spring of 1943, the illusion of German invulnerability was about to be tested. The same skies they believed would protect them would soon deliver their undoing. The Allies were coming, and they weren't aiming for the armies or the front lines. They were coming for the heart of Germany itself.
By mid-1943, the storm was forming, but the Germans couldn't yet see the clouds. Across the quiet fields of England, a new kind of army was gathering, not of infantry or tanks, but of men and machines built to fight a war from the sky. They called themselves the 8th Air Force. Every week, fresh squadrons arrived from America, filling the countryside with the thunder of engines and the scent of aviation fuel. Airfields sprouted across East Anglia like scars in the earth, each one housing rows of silver bombers gleaming under the gray British sun. These were the B-17 Flying Fortresses, giants of aluminum and steel, bristling with machine guns from nose to tail. Each could carry nearly 5 tons of explosives and still defend itself against swarms of enemy fighters. The men who flew them were mostly in their early 20s, farm boys from Kansas, mechanics from Detroit, students from New York, suddenly thrust into the most dangerous job in the world. Their mission, to destroy Germany's ability to wage war without ever setting foot on its soil. But brute force wasn't enough. The Americans believed they could win through precision. In workshops and laboratories back home, engineers had created something revolutionary: the Norden bomb sight. Hidden beneath glass and gears, it allowed bombardiers to calculate wind, speed, and altitude with mathematical perfection. In theory, it could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 6 miles high. It was so secret that crews were told to guard it with their lives. If their plane went down, they were to destroy it before capture. The Norden was more than a tool. It was a symbol of faith that science could make war cleaner, smarter, and decisive. The U.S. Army Air Forces called this new approach precision daylight bombing. Unlike the British, who struck cities by night in massive area raids, the Americans would target the machinery of war itself: factories, railways, oil refineries. The goal was simple yet audacious: break Germany's industrial spine and end the conflict without an invasion. To the generals in Washington and London, it was a gamble worth taking. To the men who had to fly those missions, it was suicide wrapped in strategy. Training for these missions was brutal. Crews practiced formation flying for hours, learning to move as one unit, dozens, sometimes hundreds of planes locked into precise patterns. Each bomber's guns protected the next, creating what they called a combat box, a fortress of interlocking firepower that no fighter could penetrate easily. Every movement, every turn had to be perfect. A single error could shatter the formation, leaving a plane alone against a sky full of enemies. In the evenings, the young airmen gathered in drafty barracks, playing cards or writing letters home. Some joked about the milk runs to come. Others stayed silent, staring at photographs tucked into their caps. They were volunteers, most of them. Few truly understood what awaited them over Germany. The flak so dense it looked like a wall of smoke. The fighters that came out of the sun. The sight of other bombers falling in flames beside them. Meanwhile, inside the Reich, confidence still reigned. The Luftwaffe's air defense network, the Kammhuber line, was considered state-of-the-art. Radar arrays swept the western sky, plotting every intruder. Batteries of 88mm guns stood ready in concentric rings around the Ruhr. German officers scoffed at the notion that any formation could survive long enough to reach their heartland in daylight. "No bomber will ever reach the Ruhr and return," one Luftwaffe commander said flatly. The words would soon haunt him. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments, boasted to Hitler that production was at record highs. Coal output was steady, steel was flowing, and the factories of the Ruhr were operating day and night. "The British have failed to stop us," he said confidently. "The Americans will do no better." But across the channel, the Americans were preparing to prove him wrong. Inside briefing rooms lit by the glow of projectors, officers outlined a new strategy, one that would strike at the very foundations of the Reich. The target? The Ruhr Valley, the beating heart of German industry. It wasn't just another raid. It was a test of an entire doctrine. Could air power alone change the course of the war? The night before the first mission, silence settled across the airfields. Engines sat cold and still under tarpaulins. Crews wrote their last letters, folded them neatly, and placed them in envelopes marked "to be delivered if missing." A few prayed. Others laughed too loudly, trying to hide the tremor in their voices. They were told to be ready at dawn.
In the darkness before sunrise, the roar of engines shattered the stillness. One by one, the bombers lifted off, their wings glinting in the first light. Below them, the English coast fell away. Ahead, the gray expanse of the North Sea stretched toward occupied Europe. They were young, untested, and outnumbered, but they carried with them the weight of a nation's faith in the skies. In Germany, radar operators watched the blips appear on their screens, small at first, then multiplying, merging, spreading. Still, commanders dismissed it as a reconnaissance sweep. Too large for scouting, one officer muttered. Too organized, another said quietly. And then, realization dawned. The bombers were not turning back. The Reich had expected many things in 1943. Another push on the Eastern Front, another summer of victories. What it never expected was that its greatest test would come not from the ground, but from above. It began before dawn on March 17, 1943. The airfields of eastern England were alive with motion, engines roaring, crews shouting over the noise, floodlights slicing through the mist. Pilots, gunners, and navigators moved in silence, each man lost in his thoughts. They all knew the statistics. They had seen too many empty bunks after missions. But they also knew that what they were about to do could change the course of the war. At 0600 hours, the first of the B-17 flying fortresses thundered down the runways and climbed into the gray dawn. One by one, the bombers lifted, their silhouettes merging into a vast armada that stretched across the English sky. Below, the fields of East Anglia disappeared under cloud. Ahead, across the cold waters of the North Sea, lay the industrial heart of Nazi Germany, the Ruhr Valley. Inside each bomber, the crew performed their routines like clockwork. Oxygen masks on, guns loaded, coordinates double-checked. In the confined spaces of the aircraft, every sound was amplified. The hum of engines, the crackle of the radio, the creak of aluminum under strain. Somewhere in the distance, a man began humming a song, half to stay calm, half to drown out the silence. At 8:17 a.m., the first radar operators along the German frontier spotted the incoming formations. Unidentified aircraft, approaching at altitude. Within minutes, the alarm spread across the western defenses. Sirens wailed through the Ruhr as anti-aircraft batteries roared to life. Fighters scrambled from bases across the region. To the Germans, it was inconceivable. No enemy had ever dared strike this deep in daylight. Surely this was a reconnaissance sweep. But as the black dots over the Rhine grew larger, the truth became impossible to ignore. The bombers were coming, and they weren't turning back. The first flak bursts erupted above the Ruhr, black puffs exploding in perfect patterns across the sky. The concussions rocked the B-17s, filling the air with smoke and metal. Pilots gritted their teeth, holding formation. "Keep tight," the lead navigator barked over the radio. "Don't drift. We're almost there." Through the turbulence and chaos, the formation held, a geometric wall of steel advancing through hell. German fighters streaked through the clouds, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs diving at impossible angles, their cannons flashing white. Machine gun tracers laced the air. A bomber to the left caught fire and spiraled downward, trailing smoke and debris. The crew of another shouted for a medic as a gunner slumped over his turret. Yet the formation pressed on, no turning back. At 8:30 a.m., the command finally came. "Bombs away!" The bomb bay doors opened. The planes shuddered as thousands of pounds of explosives dropped into the air. From the ground, the sight was surreal, streams of black dots falling from the heavens, silent for a moment, then followed by an apocalyptic roar. The first detonations ripped through the industrial zone. The Krupp Steelworks, the symbol of German industrial might, was the first to vanish. Fireballs erupted from its furnaces, molten steel pouring through shattered floors like rivers of lava. The Siemens and Thyssen plants followed, engulfed in smoke and flame. The ground shook for miles. Inside the factories, workers screamed and scattered. The lucky ones made it to shelters, many did not. In the streets, men and women stared skyward as their world fell apart. One machinist later recalled, "The air itself burned. It was as if the sun had fallen upon us." In the command centers, disbelief turned to chaos. Field telephones rang unanswered. Reports came in fragmented. Essen burning, Krupp destroyed, communications down. Officers shouted conflicting orders, desperate to mount a counterattack, but their fighters were running out of fuel and ammunition. A Luftwaffe controller slammed his fist on the table. "They came in daylight," he said, "and they did not stop."
Even Hitler's inner circle was stunned. When Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, received word of the devastation, he stared silently at the damage reports. The numbers didn't make sense. Entire sectors of production wiped out in a single raid. "It cannot be," he muttered. "They were not supposed to reach us." When the news reached Hitler, his fury was volcanic. He raged at his generals, blaming the Luftwaffe, the weather, even fate itself. "No enemy can strike the heart of Germany," he shouted. But outside his window, the sky glowed faintly red from the fires hundreds of kilometers away. For the German people, it was a day of awakening. Civilians poured into the streets of Essen and Dortmund, faces streaked with soot and tears. The once proud factory workers who had fueled the Reich's war machine now stood amid twisted metal and rubble. The pride they had once felt, the belief that they were the invincible arm of a mighty empire, was gone. "What do we rebuild from here?" one foreman whispered, staring at the molten ruins of his factory. There would be no easy answer. In the coming weeks, the psychological toll spread far beyond the Ruhr. The myth of safety inside the Reich was broken. The ordinary German citizen, once insulated from the war's destruction, now lived in its shadow. Families began building makeshift shelters in basements. Trains carrying refugees from bombed cities became a common sight. The regime's propaganda could no longer hide the truth. The war had come home. For the Allies, the raid was more than a tactical success. It was proof of concept. Precision bombing worked. The idea that an air force could cripple an enemy without invading its soil was no longer theory. It was reality. The U.S. Army Air Forces had validated their strategy, and the skies over Europe would never be the same. In the months that followed, the raids grew larger, deadlier, and more precise. By the summer of 1943, the daylight skies above Germany belonged to the Americans and British alike. But victory came at a cost. Hundreds of airmen never made it home. Their bombers fell in flames, swallowed by clouds of smoke. For those who survived, the images of the burning Ruhr would never fade. They had done what no army had done before. They had broken an empire from the sky, but they paid for it in blood and steel. For Germany, the raid marked the beginning of the end. The Luftwaffe was forced to stretch its already thin defenses, diverting fighters from the Eastern Front just to protect the homeland. Fuel shortages worsened. Production plummeted. Even the most loyal officers began to wonder, if the Allies could destroy the Ruhr, what could they not destroy? In the quiet of his Wolf's Lair bunker, Hitler studied the latest reconnaissance photos. Entire industrial districts reduced to ash. For the first time, he said nothing. Those around him knew what it meant. The man who had promised a 1,000-year Reich was now watching it burn after just 10. The March 17th raid was more than a military operation. It was a psychological rupture. It shattered the illusion of invincibility and exposed the fragility of the Reich's war machine. From that day on, Germany's struggle was no longer about conquest. It was about endurance, about surviving the endless storm that now came from above. The skies that had once symbolized German dominance now belonged to their enemy. And every time the air raid sirens wailed, every time the engines roared overhead, the people of Germany remembered that first morning when the sky itself turned against them. In the days that followed, the smoke over the Ruhr refused to fade. Entire districts remained smoldering ruins. Factories twisted into blackened skeletons. Rail lines bent and melted from the heat. Engineers, who once boasted of Germany's indestructible industry, stood in silence, staring at the wreckage. For the first time, the Nazi leadership confronted a truth they had long ignored. The war could be lost not in the trenches, but in the air. Reports flooded into Berlin. Production in key industrial centers had dropped by more than half. Steel output collapsed, and assembly lines stood idle for lack of materials. Hitler's generals demanded answers. How could this have happened? How had the enemy crossed their defenses in broad daylight?
The Führer's rage turned inward, directed at his own commanders, but no reprimand could rebuild what had been lost. Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments, wrote later that this moment marked a turning point in his understanding of the war. For the first time, he said, we realized that no fortress on earth could protect a nation from the skies. His factories would rebuild, yes, but never fast enough. Each time production recovered, another wave of bombers would return, undoing months of labor in a single night. Militarily, the consequences were immediate and devastating. The Luftwaffe was forced to divert fighter squadrons from the Eastern Front to defend the homeland. Fuel reserves that once powered panzers were now spent, keeping the air defenses alive. And as the Allies intensified their raids, targeting refineries, rail hubs, and synthetic fuel plants, Germany's once mighty war machine began to suffocate.
But perhaps the greatest damage wasn't measured in steel or fuel. It was psychological. The German people, who had been told for years that their cities were untouchable, began to doubt. Air raid sirens became a part of daily life. Workers slept in shelters rather than their homes. Every distant rumble made them wonder if another storm was coming. Inside the Luftwaffe command, frustration turned to despair. Their fighter pilots, once heroes of the Blitz, were now outnumbered and outgunned. They could destroy a few bombers, yes, but not enough to stop the tide. For every American plane shot down, 2 more arrived the next week. The balance of power in the skies had shifted irreversibly. The bombing of the Ruhr wasn't the end of the war, but it marked the beginning of the end. The illusion of German invulnerability had been erased, replaced by a grim reality. The Reich was bleeding from within. The Americans had proven that victory could come not just from the ground, but from the heavens. From that moment forward, every German leader, from Hitler to the lowest factory foreman, lived with the same haunting question. If the Americans could reach the Ruhr, what would they destroy next? In the ashes of the Ruhr, a new era of warfare was born. Germany entered 1943, believing its power was unshakable, its factories invincible, its cities untouchable. But the raid over the Ruhr shattered that illusion. For the first time, the Reich understood that the war could be lost from above. The Americans hadn't just bombed steel and concrete. They had struck at the very heart of Nazi confidence. The myth of invincibility was gone. The skies, once Germany's shield, had become its greatest vulnerability. From that point forward, the war was no longer fought only on the ground. It was fought in the air, where technology, precision, and courage decided the fate of nations. The lesson was unmistakable. Air power would define the wars of the future. And as the smoke cleared over the Ruhr, one truth remained. No empire, no matter how mighty, could ever again claim to be beyond the reach of the sky.